Welcome back to the Midweek Mixup, the podcast where we take what we're learning during the 1 hour where we gather every single weekend to hear a Bible teaching and to pray and to sing and all of those things. We try to see how we can take that 1 hour deeper into the other 167 hours of every single week. I'm here with Austin Maxheimer this week, and Austin was actually our teacher this week, so it's really cool to have the opportunity to sit down with you, Austin, just a little bit longer, hear a little bit more of your heart. But first, just tell us a little bit about who you are, how you're connected with us. Just introduce yourself.
Sure thing. So, I have become the neighborhood guy,
Right.
which is interesting to me at 42 years old. Because I have a lot of other interests actually in life. I love playing sports and being active. I'm fascinated by biblical interpretation and hermeneutics, which is just the art and science of interpretation, if you aren't familiar with that word. And I actually got connected to One Life Henderson over a decade ago because I'm passionate about just Christian community, just living in Christian community. And that led me to move back to Evansville to start a house church network, which then I connected with Discovery Church and One Life Network to help be the core planning team for One Life West. And so for a year and a half, I came over every single day to across that money-saving bridge to downtown Henderson, and that's where our One Life Network offices were. And so I became kind of a pseudo-Hendersonian for a while and got my start in neighborhood work in the East End. But as God has kind of shaped me and directed me over the years, I have become more and more passionate and kind of singularly focused on neighborhood work, and especially helping Christians and churches engage in neighborhood revitalization, as I say it, as a fulfillment or an expression of Jesus' ministry to marginalized neighbors.
You know, it almost, like the way that just all rolled off your tongue like that, it almost sounds like you have a doctorate in that or something. No, tell us a little bit about your education, because I've always kind of joked around. For a pretty long season, I was the growth groups director here at One Life Henderson. I'm the communications director now, but I used to joke that when I would read some of the stuff that you had written 5 years ago, and I was kind of just discovering it, and I would call myself the wish.com Austin Maxheimer. and I feel like you have a doctorate in growth groups, basically. I mean, that's kind of where you're at, but just share a little bit about that and the journey and how you got there.
Well, that's how far back do we go? So it's funny, so I had a radical, I spent several years very far from God and had kind of a radical conversion moment. Won't get into that. But when that happened, I just wanted to go and learn more about Jesus and God. And so in America, what do? When you want to learn something, you go to school. And so I immediately signed up for seminary, and I arrived there and I was like, oh, these are all vocational pastors.
A little different.
Yeah, I was like, that's not why I was there. I didn't ever think I would work for a church. Nothing against that.
Right.
Love you, Brett. Love you, Josh. And but yeah. So, but I just didn't think that was my trajectory. I really had a heart to want to build smaller expressions of different Christian communities, and then see them deployed or sent into the world to be bearers of the gospel. And so some way that's said is missional communities. And so then when we tried to shift our small groups ministry or life groups ministry to be more missional, and it kind of, for lack of a better way, to say it nicely, it fell flat a little bit here at One Life. I went back to seminary a second time, second round of seminary, to pursue activating missional communities, to see about what groups of disciples that are living in community together look like when they engage in the mission of God and join Him in His ministry of reconciliation in the world. And so as I had journeyed through that, though, again, I had become more and more convinced that God's heart had always been for marginalized neighbors, and that He's called His people to do that. And so while the idea of missional community is broad, it doesn't have to be in neighborhood work. It can be to communities of art or faith and work, or many expressions of missional communities, because God cares for all of His creation. My particular bent was towards marginalized neighbors and neighborhood revitalization as an expression of that. And so that's what my dissertation was on, was church engagement in neighborhood work, trying to find out what catalyzes and sustains people in that work. And so, I've been thinking about it and reflecting on it and writing about it and doing research on it for a very long time now, it feels like.
Yeah, it seems pretty second nature to you at this point. Yeah. Well, that's a really good segue, because we're in the middle of this series right now called We Are the Church. And the teaching that you got to do for us this week is all about how we are the church in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And if you are watching or listening to this and you haven't got a chance to hear Austin's teaching yet, there's going to be a link for that in the show notes. You can watch that. It's really a fascinating teaching. And as I've been listening to you talk for the last couple of minutes, you clearly know the subject matter pretty well.
I better.
Right, exactly. But just tell us a little bit more. And I have some notes here, but I really just want to hear a little bit more from you. Is there anything that you didn't get to share, maybe not enough time or not enough, whatever capacity that you would like to share? I mean, the floor is yours.
Oh my goodness, that's too open-ended for me, Josh.
Well, we can tighten it up a little bit.
Because, and I say that because how do you cram 12 years of lived experience,
right.
Countless hours of Bible study and reflection, and just really, how do you cram that into 30 minutes or 35 minutes? It's really impossible. And so I did write a book on the content to try to house all the things that I've learned that God's shown me and represents the research that I did, the sociological research that I did through my doctorate. And so all of that is in the book.
That's great.
But I would say that one of the things that I didn't get to in the videos is really helping people to understand how neighborhoods like the East End or TP Park, which is the neighborhood I live in, get to the state they're in. Mm-hmm. And so kind of the simplest way that we say this is through disinvestment.
Okay.
So when you think about a long time ago, before automobiles, everything in a community had to be in the same space. You had to live, work, worship, play, entertainment, all that had to be in one walkable neighborhood. Well, then as we built our cities for pedestrians, for cars instead of pedestrians, investment had to go out to the suburbs or out to these shopping centers or out to these places, right? And just simply where investment goes, that means there's only so much resources. It doesn't occur in these city core neighborhoods, right? And so as suburban sprawl happened, the center city cores really experienced decades of disinvestment. And so what happens when you experience disinvestment, when sidewalks deteriorate, neighborhood schools aren't invested in, the housing stock isn't repaired and restored, and new houses aren't built, that becomes a place where it becomes affordable for neighbors. And people that are experiencing poverty get concentrated into these neighborhoods simply where they can afford to live. And so that is like the core concept that I didn't get to communicate that's really important for us to understand as community members. When you think about an area like Henderson or the west side of Evansville or the south side where I live, when you think about a broader community, every community has these pockets where neighbors that are experiencing marginalization through poverty, that's happened through a slow and gradual process where then poverty gets concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. And so as the body of Christ, we can then go be restorers when we're sent into those communities in order to bring the light of Christ, the hope of Christ, the restorative ministry of Christ into the lives of neighbors that are experiencing these lived realities.
Yeah. So one part of our vision language around here is that we want to be a city that multiplies restorative hope, and you and I agree. And I would think that a lot of the people listening to this recognize that we believe that restorative hope is through Jesus. Amen. And how do we, as followers of Jesus, act as agents in that restorative journey, in bringing restorative hope to Henderson, to our workplace or our lives or whatever? You said something during the teaching, and you shared a story about toxic charity. And I'm not going to ask you to repeat that story. However, if you're listening to this, you need to go and listen to it, because it's one of those stories that kind of is a facepalm moment, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, I get that. But you said that sometimes serving others doesn't look like restoration. It looks like just helping someone get by to the next day. Can you flesh that out a little bit more, what that looks like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all credit to Bob Lupton and Toxic Charity, because I'm just stealing this from there. So we all know the axiom or saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day, give a man a fish, feed him for life, right? So we understand that, and that oftentimes is how we approach charity work, is that we give someone a fish. Right. We hand out clothes, we hand out meals. And I want to say, just for the record, there is a time and place for that.
Sure.
Sometimes people just need food in their belly. If you've ever had a headache or migraine, you just want to take the pill that knocks you out, that gets the headache gone. You're not thinking about long-term goal achievement, right? Like, the goal is to get past this migraine.
Right, absolutely.
So relief work is important and has its place, but for a church, that can't be the end goal. That can't be the end of the process. We need to go to restorative. And unfortunately in America, we suffer from consumerism and individualism. And so we want to consume and we want to be all about ourselves. Right. And that is not the picture in any shape, form, or fashion of the church that God lays out from Genesis to Revelation. It's a picture of a community of people that are pursuing and participating in His will, His design of reconciliation, bringing hope into the world, not ourselves and consuming. And so when we think about shaping an outreach ministry or philosophy around how we engage marginalized neighbors or people that we want to help, it has to start with those two components of restoration and activation. It has to move beyond giving someone a fish, and it has to move towards how do we restore them in the wholeness of their being, and then how do we activate them into the mission of God so that they can be participants in the restorative process themselves, because that's how God shapes us into the likeness of Jesus Christ, is through us participating in His kingdom, not through being given a meal or in fact, oftentimes taking the dignity away from neighbors by doing for them what they could do for themselves. And so then we create these cycles of dependency, because when the food runs out, where do they have to go? To the person who gave them the fish. When the clothes run out, where do they have to go? To the people that gave them the clothes. Instead of building that into the community itself so that they can become whole communities, even as they become whole neighbors themselves.
Yeah, that's great. And so one of the kind of the primary things that we want to do on this podcast, but also just as followers of Jesus, is to figure out, okay, most of us come to church once a week, maybe once or every other week, or, whatever that looks like.
3 weeks now is what they say.
The average is about every 3 weeks. And I think, for the most part, that's true. I mean, from my experience and being here a lot and bumping into people. And so every other week, every third week, we come to church, but what do we do with it when we leave church? And the main thrust of your teaching was, okay, God has called us to be agents of change and bring this restorative hope that we talk about here at One Life Henderson. But the main thrust was you got to participate, you got to get in the game. So just can you tell us a little bit more? Number one, I would like to hear any story that you can think of about how that sort of started to happen for you, because you started working here at One Life Henderson many years ago, and you took that into the 167 by going and knocking on doors and doing all sorts of different things. But how can you take this into the 167, or how would you encourage those listening to make this applicable, make it practical, and actually get in the game?
Yeah, I was gonna go a different direction until you added that onto the end. So I am a learner and experimenter by nature. And so it's kind of easy for me. When that invitation got extended to go door knocking in the East End, I was like, oh, that sounds like something Jesus would do, so I want to go do that.
Yeah.
Like, I wanted to follow Jesus into the missional frontier because I desired to align my life completely and totally with Jesus. And so then it was all just fun for me. Like, I just went and participated in all these neighborhood events and processes that were going on because it was exciting and it was engaging and it was thrilling. So my own personal journey was when I started to get to know neighbors that really settled me into that. Like a story This was actually in the Jacobsville neighborhood, not necessarily in the East End, but when early on in the process, I met a neighbor there whose name was Melissa, who by outward appearances would have been like your classic neighbor from a she was single mom, or no, she was not a single mom, but her husband was dealing with addiction issues. She had 3 kids. They were tugged with everywhere. She was had some physical disabilities, and those by outward perceptions and just by sight, I might have written her off or discounted her. But I had went through the formative experience of doing the neighborhood work here in the East End first, and I got to know Melissa as a person, and I listened to her first, and I just spent time with her. And so I got what I discovered was that Melissa's more capable than me. Right. She's high capacity. She started her own organization, throwing her worries away, because she just wanted to pick up trash and meet neighbors. And she was living the mission of God. And it was just amazing to get to know her. She's an incredible public speaker, just a wonderful, incredible mother. But through that relationship, then I ended up grouping with her for a couple of years. She got connected at One Life West because she saw the church transforming her community.
That's awesome.
And she ended up getting baptized herself, and then she baptized her girls. And she still leads and attends at West and still leads in her neighborhood initiative. And so it's just, these are the stories that happen. And so getting to know neighbors and seeing transformation, that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have went on the journey, if I wouldn't have been present, if I wouldn't have stepped into the work and went with it with no agenda, but just to learn and be present as the body of Christ. That wouldn't have happened without doing that. And so those are the stories that kind of are replicated and keep you going, because it can be kind of weighty, this work, the neighborhood revitalization. The principalities and powers of the world, there's a reason why there's generational poverty and issues and systemic things that happen that create the outcomes that we've produced as a society, and they're tough to wage war against. But we have God on our side, and we have overcome because He overcame the world. So there's a lot in there, but
that's great. And I mean, I can't even imagine how many stories that you have. From Henderson, from Jacobsville, from wherever you've been, and just different things. Maybe we should just do an episode where you just tell stories.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, for sure. Stories are the best, right? People like stories the most.
That's right.
I did want to add one thing, though, because where I was going to go first, and we can move on for that. When you were asking that question the first time, my gut reaction was, well, first of all, you got to spend time with Jesus. You got to spend time at his feet. Because if you're following Jesus, truly following him, and this is not to be, heavy-handed towards someone, I don't know how you don't follow him into ministry to marginalized neighbors. Now, that doesn't have to look like neighborhood revitalization. There's other neighbors and communities that are marginalized besides generational poverty in our community. I think about the elderly, and I think about, there's lots of marginalized neighbors or expressions of that. They just happen. Neighborhoods are good because they just happen. A lot of neighbors that are marginalized are concentrated heavily in a few core neighborhoods. But you don't have to do neighborhood work. But if you're following Jesus, you're going to be around marginalized neighbors. You just are. I mean, you can't go through the Gospels. So if you're spending the time at his feet, and you don't have any sort of ministry marginalized neighbors, you might want to spend some more time at his feet, right? So that's number one. But number two is get in community with other people.
Absolutely.
Not everyone can do everything. You can't, Josh Stanley, Austin Maxheimer, Nivea Carter can't revitalize the East End. That's ridiculous.
Right.
We need Christians around us, and we need the church as a whole to participate. We say it this way: if everyone brings something, then not everyone has to bring everything.
That's great.
And it's a way to lessen the load of it, right? And that's the beauty and gift of Christian community. And we that is what, when we're not living, this is the problem with individualism in our culture, is that it's a gift to us. Christian community is a gift to us. Oh, and by the way, also if you're sitting at the feet of Jesus regularly, you're going to be in community with other people because that was his missional approach. Was he gathered up 12 men to live in small group with, and they went on mission together, which, by the way, was the whole point of From Couch to Community, missional small groups. We kind of missed that. We're just trying to follow Jesus. But those are a couple more things that I wanted to say about it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And all of that is really a lot to chew on in terms of like, what can I do in my life to make these things happen? Something that I've heard in several occasions, and I may have even heard you say it in another context at some point, but something that you shared the story about Melissa. And I think in practical terms, the two things that I've heard multiple occasions is see potential and know their story.
Oh my gosh.
See potential and know their story. Mm-hmm. And you shared the story about Melissa, and without those things, you just, it's like, well, she's this and she's that, or what, and that can be writ large for any neighborhood in any city. Like, I see someone and I make assumptions and I write them off, whatever. But if you just think this person's got some potential, and if they bring something, then I don't have to bring everything.
Exactly.
And then just know their story, asking like, what have you been through? Yeah. Where have you been? What have you seen? What do you bring to the table? And then being able to, like you said, gather a community around. Like, we've all got a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And the things that I bring to the table are different than the things that you bring to the table. And that just goes all the way around. That's really, really cool. So if you go ahead.
Well, and it gets to one of the things I also didn't get to talk about in the message is the posture of which we go about the work. So oftentimes we come into neighborhood work, people experiencing poverty, and again, well-intended, but the posture that we have by virtue of the systems that we've created is that we have the answers for you. That we have the goods and services that you need, that we know that you need financial literacy. We know the things that you need, right? Before we ever listen to anyone or build a single relationship. We assume that we have the answers, and we assume that we have the directions that neighbors need. And so the posture that we come with, which again is just in the way of Jesus, is one of humility, being a learner and being a relationship builder and being curious and believing that they are created in the image of God and have inherent dignity, and that God wants to activate them the same way that he redeemed and activated me into his mission. And so just coming with that posture is not typically how we approach what is classically called like poverty work or charity work. And so really redefining that. And that's why we say, don't start something right away.
Right.
Because it's okay to live for a season just building relationships and listening to neighbors. And by the way, there's probably a lot of things already going on underway. One of the things that we talk about when we're training on neighborhood work is that oftentimes we think that neighborhood work is mission or evangelism, and that these poor people need Jesus, right? And the reality is that in our neighborhood, 71% of our neighbors are already Christian.
Oh, wow.
So these are actually our brothers and sisters in Christ.
Wow.
These are not people far from God. They're just people that have barriers to loving God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. And so in a lot of ways, we've tried to reframe our neighborhood work around John 17, and that this is how the world will come to know me, is through our love for one another.
Yeah.
If we can love our brothers and sisters in Christ really well and bring restoration to these communities, then the world would have to say, oh, our ways of transforming these neighborhoods doesn't work.
Yeah.
But look at the church. Wow, they're loving their brothers and sisters really well, and they're bringing about restoration and activation. That is something that we may need to pay attention to.
No, that's so good. That's so good. So before we I want to ask you one more question. But before we do that, what is the number one practical, if you could tell whomever's listening to this right now, turn off YouTube, turn off Apple Podcasts, and go step out the door and do this today. What is that practical one step?
Oh, yeah. First of all, thank you, and I love you for asking that question. Now I'm going to back way up and do a self-apology. So my job at Community One was actually created to help mobilize the church into neighborhood revitalization work, that the revitalization work would be a platform for engagement for Christians. And I'll say, as I've learned and God has transformed my heart and mind, I would say that there just isn't a clean answer. Like, it's really, these issues are complex, both internally in churches and internally in neighborhoods and internally in each one of us, right? Like, we all have schedules, and some people are like, even though I might be middle class, I can't even hardly, my kids are a mess, and my backyard is not mowed, and like,
right.
like, how in the world do you want me to go help in neighborhood work? So these issues are just so complex, and so I've actually had a pretty tough time coming up with very simple, practical things. But the simplest and practicalness I could do, which I actually did say in the message, but just to reiterate, is just go and be. Go and enter those spaces. So Jesus never left the missional frontier. He never asked his disciples, to do things that he wasn't going to do. And I don't know how we can ask other people to do things that we aren't willing to go. We have to go first. We have to be present. But we don't have to go with all the answers or with all the activity. We just need to start going and be. And so Renew Church on the west side is leading a Love Your Neighborhood initiative. They're the neighborhood-based organization, and they did something really cool. For 6 straight weeks, they gave one application step to their congregation. They said, just go and be present. Just go and be. Bring your lunch. Go eat at a restaurant there. Go prayer walk on a block. Go trick-or-treating. Halloween's coming up. Go trick-or-treating in the neighborhood instead of your neighborhood. Like, they challenge people for 6 straight weeks, one application point. Just go and be present in the neighborhood. And then to write that on a Post-it note, and then they stuck it on a map, and they collected that over time. And I just love that. And I think God and His Spirit will continue to direct One Life Henderson and individual Christians if they do that. If they just go and be present and see what happens and be open to God's Spirit and guiding, that would be my most practical step. Second one, real quick, it would be to support what's already going on.
Yeah.
There is a Love Your Neighbor initiative going on. Audubon Kids Zone's going on. South Heights is in the school in the community. Like, there's other activities that are going on there. And start thinking outside the box. Like, you may not think that going and eating at Metzger's, a burger at Metzger's, is like kingdom work, but a lot of communities like the East End, one of the biggest deficits they have is economic development, economic opportunity. And so when you go and support businesses that are contributing to the flourishing of a community by giving them access to food and entertainment, like, that is actually, and that's a pretty low bar, right?
Yeah.
Go have a burger.
You don't have to do a lot to convince me to go eat at Metzger's. Metzger's is, it's worth it. It's worth it.
But these are the simple things that as in Romans 12, as God transforms our mind to be more kingdom-minded, when we have eyes to see a more holistic approach to ministry that talks about flourishing communities and holistic flourishing of neighbors, that we can start to bring small pieces of ourselves to bear in these ways. And they actually are simple and practical, even if they don't feel like the classic ways of doing outreach or service work.
That's great. So before we wrap up, just spend a couple minutes just telling us everything that's happening. You've got Love Your Neighborhood. You've got this new book. You've got just share a little bit about how you would love for people to connect to those things.
Yeah. So I moved into the neighborhood that I work in. So, I was a lifelong West Sider, played rights football, the whole shebang, right? And so it took a move of God to get me out of there. But He's just drawn my heart more and more into the neighborhood work. And so being incarnational in that way transforms everything. When you realize that you've got to drive 15 minutes to go get groceries, when there's literally no entertainment option in your neighborhood, when you hear gunshots outside of your window at 11 o'clock at night or 3 o'clock in the morning, like, these are, this is what it means when God left the heavens and came into the world, right? Like, so if this really speaks to you and encourages you, like, it's a bold step. Like, it took me 7 years for God to align our home to where my wife was willing to do it. So I'm not saying today, but like, think about it. Like, think about living in the East End. Like, if this is really speaking to you, being incarnational in that way, it changes things. It's not a them anymore. It's we, and it's us now. It's my neighbors, like literal neighbors. And so that's one of the things that God's doing in me. I did publish the book. It's the culmination of a lot of things. I'd love it if you read it and bought like 100,000 copies. That'd be great.
That would be great.
Yeah, we've got 5 Love Your Neighborhood initiatives going on in our region, which is amazing. Again, that's the legacy of One Life Henderson. Like, I've helped develop that and lead it and multiply it in our community, but that started because of the faithfulness of people like Heath Farmer and Mark Weaver and these guys that, when we were planting One Life Henderson, had a heart for the East End.
Yeah.
And like, that is a legacy of God's work in the community. So yeah, learn more about that and Love Your Neighborhood initiatives. And then the Kids Zone stuff is transformative. I would encourage you to learn more about the Kids Zone stuff, because I love neighborhood revitalization. I don't personally like working with kids, but I think if there's one thing that we could try as an experiment, as a community, it is, how do we wrap individual customized care from cradle to career, continuity of care around each individual kid, and making sure that they succeed in partnership with the kids' families, like that, and tracking individual kids' interventions, like that is a revolutionary, paradigm-shifting idea that I think that I know of, that has the best hope for truly transforming communities and people that are experiencing generational poverty. So I think investing in that as a church and as individuals is exciting, and like it's really cool. And so you can share again with them the overlay of the Kids Zone and Love Your Neighborhood initiatives that are going on in our region, which includes Henderson, includes the East End, and just see that as God's special loving care for marginalized neighbors, and then start to think and process how you can participate in that. Those are things that God is doing in my heart. That and wiffle ball on Tuesday nights.
There you go. Wiffle ball in TV Park, I'm assuming, right?
No.
Okay.
0.7 miles away in the Arts District. It's pretty close to my house, but
okay. Well, that's good. Wiffle ball around here is Gaga ball has become real popular. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that? Do you all have that there?
No. Oh, I'm sure we have it, but I don't personally do it. So.
Yeah, I haven't played it, but I went to camp this year with the high schoolers, and I learned a lot about it. And it looks fun, but. Well, Austin, is there anything else before we close down that you just want to share, or anything on your mind?
No, just one final gratitude towards One Life Henderson and just One Life Church in general. The original mission of helping people far from God experience Jesus is what turned my heart towards One Life, and I hope as you guys kind of look into what's next for One Life Henderson in the next season with the new lead pastor coming, and it's good and right to hit refresh. I hope that always is retained as like kind of a core element. Like we live in the Bible Belt. There's a lot of people that know Jesus, and I think helping people far from God experience Jesus inspires us missionally, but it also is what disciples us. And when we talk about needing meat and all these things, like the meat is in the streets, the meat is in the neighborhood, the transformative experiences that God has for us is when we help people far from God experience Jesus. So I've always loved that kind of dual side, and I hope that's retained in Henderson. So just a big thank you, and I'll be praying for you as you guys think about what's next, and just excited to see where God turns your hearts as a church body.
That's awesome. Thank you, Austin. Thanks for being here. And that about wraps us up for this week's episode of the Midweek Mixup. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a comment if wherever you're listening allows you to do that. Austin dropped a lot of resources throughout this episode. We're going to leave links for all of that in the show notes, from his book to the Love Your Neighborhood initiatives to Melissa's organization, all those things that he mentioned. We'll leave links for all that in the comments. We would love if you would just continue to interact with us, continue to go on this journey with us, because as we've been talking about during this series, we are the church in our other people's lives, in our neighborhoods, in our city, and in our world. Don't forget, as we go out into this next week, let's go out and seize the 167 together.
Amen.